Hello, my friends. Welcome to Origins. What a privilege to have you with us today. My name's Don Chapman, and I get to be your host. You know, Origins is a forum where we take the evidence of science and we use it to validate the truth of God's creation. We do that by interviewing creation scientists, and we have a great one with us today. Michael Oard is with us. He got his education at the University of Washington, and he then worked there for 6 years doing research, and then he went to the National Weather Service, where he was a meteorologist for 30 years, and since then he's retired and he's just writing and doing research. Other creation scientists tell me that he's one of the great researchers in the whole field of creation science. So, Michael, it's so good to have you with us.
Oh, thank you.
And today we're going to talk about dinosaurs. Everybody loves to talk about dinosaurs. These aren't purple dinosaurs, are they?
Oh, no, these are real ones you find from the bones.
Okay, good. And the name of our show is Dinosaur Challenges Explained. Would you help me understand what challenges we're going to look at?
These are challenges to the flood model. The flood buried all those except those in the ark. But there's a lot of features we find in the rocks that show we had live dinosaurs at that time, namely tracks, eggs, and scavenged bone beds. They were alive, and they died with the flood. How did they do that? How did they make tracks during the chaos of the flood?
Tracks? So these are dinosaurs that were actually living during the first part of the flood.
Yes, that's where I would place them. Other people would want to try to place them other places, but I have evidence it has to be early in the flood.
And this has impacted some creation scientists, hasn't it?
Oh, yeah.
You have a quote there.
Yes, this is from Science Magazine. A young earth creationist named Godfrey, getting his degree. Out in the fields, he was quoted as saying this: "By day, coring through thin layers of rock, we started to come across footprints of terrestrial animals. You can't imagine a global flood and animals finding ground to make footprints on." See, that's the problem. That, more than anything, any other experience in my life really shook me to the core. So this really shook his faith. And from what I understand, he lost, at least temporarily, from what the article said. He became an evolutionist. And this is not unique to him. A lot of other people have considered this a major challenge to the flood.
Well, it sounds like we have an important question and that we need to answer. And so I'm going to ask you to go up at the board and deal with this issue.
Well, the first thing I'm going to tell you about is the challenge. Here's a dinosaur track of a three-toed carnivorous dinosaur. It's one of a trail. And this is made on flood rocks, thousands of feet of flood rocks. Here's another dinosaur track. This is found on top of a coal layer. You do find them on top of coal mines in Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, the United Kingdom, and Australia. So how does that happen? And this is a plot. This is an old plot of 1,500 locations where dinosaur tracks have been found. Now, I know that a number more can be filled in here because I read about them, like South Central Alaska, Southwest Alaska, even in Southeast Greenland there's tracks. There are billions of tracks now out in the fossil record. Billions.
Billions of dinosaur tracks.
Yes, billions. And we have the same problem with eggs. We find dinosaur eggs now, like this one right here. And a plot of eggs. This is an old plot of 199 sites, and there's a lot more. Every year they find more and more. There is considered to be millions of dinosaur eggs in the rocks. Then we have another phenomenon that shows live dinosaurs during the flood that were doing what seemed like normal dinosaur activities. What you're seeing here are teeth marks from...
oh, that's teeth marks in the rocks, okay.
No, that's not a rock, that's a dinosaur bone.
Okay,
so it's teeth marks in a dinosaur bone. Also, right where you see those red triangles, you see bite marks on a dinosaur bone. There's lots of bone beds of various sizes. Some have 10,000 dinosaurs in them, all the same species, which is a major mystery. But you find broken teeth of carnivorous dinosaurs in the bone beds. Now, these dinosaurs, when they chomp on a bone, they break their teeth really easy, but they grow new ones, you see, so it's not a problem for them. But when you find only their teeth there, and you find other marks on the bones, you know they were scavenging the bones. Their bones were sitting around there for a while, and they scavenged them. when you only find the teeth and not the rest of the skeleton. So you have the issue of dinosaur tracks, dinosaur eggs, and scavenged bone beds just sitting around there. How does this happen early in the chaos of the flood? See, this is what people have a problem with. Well, what do we do about it? What I believe we do is we apply 1 Thessalonians 5:21 to it. Examine the data carefully. Hold fast to the Bible. Hold fast to Jesus as my Lord and Savior. But examine it. It appears like, it seems like dinosaur activity, normal dinosaur activity caught in the rocks. But when you look a little further, you find a different story. First of all, people try to say because of this, the dinosaurs had to live after the flood. Or there's even a few that says maybe they're before the flood. Well, when we find dinosaurs in the sedimentary rocks, we can pinpoint it to the early flood. How? Because the dinosaur material right in here, we know that it's on top of thousands of feet of sedimentary rocks. This is the current continental surface right here. And we know that there was a lot of material on top of it at one time. And this is the max depth of the material right in here. And this was eroded during the retreating stage of the flood, down to the level we see the tracks, eggs, and scavenged bone beds. So this is flood sediments, and this is retreating stage erosion. So it's obviously this was from the early part of the flood. Now, when you examine the dinosaur material, like I said, you find evidence that it's not from a natural environment. Which they try to say it is. There's so many unusual features. We'll start with the bones. Numerous dinosaur graveyards, some of them are huge. You know, if animals die today, they don't usually die in huge areas. They're usually here and there. But there's some dinosaur graveyards that are thousands, tens of thousands of dinosaurs. There's one northwest of where I live. It's a minimum of 10,000 duck-billed dinosaurs, all of the same species. So how do you get those? I mean, these aren't normal floods that they talk about, but huge catastrophic inundations is the description of this bone bed. They're also commonly described as being buried in a flood. Yeah, all these bones are from a flood. They're also often jumbled up together, like showing a huge catastrophe. They're little weathered, like they didn't sit around very long, even though some were scavenged. They didn't sit around very long before they were finally covered. Many of these bone beds contain just one type of dinosaur, like that bone bed I was telling you in Montana with 10,000. It's all one type of duck-billed dinosaur. How do you get 10,000 of all the same species died in one catastrophe without other dinosaurs in there? Now, not all bone beds have only one type, but a lot do, which tells you there's something unusual. It's just not a natural, normal catastrophe that killed them. Also, here's a very key factor. The bones of babies and young juveniles are rare. Now, in a catastrophe, the ones that are going to especially die are going to be the young and the juveniles. But you don't find them in these bone beds. The skeletons of babies and young juveniles are very rare. So this suggests the possibility that maybe they were running from a catastrophe, herded up, and those that couldn't keep up, like the babies and young juveniles, they died right away.
Left behind.
In the flood, left behind.
Yeah.
And the rest ran for a while and were able to make tracks, lay eggs, scavenge, and so forth. So these unusual features add up more to a global catastrophe, because these are all globally found, these sorts of things. And here's an example of a coliphus graveyard in New Mexico. Well over 1,000 dinosaurs. These are small little carnivorous dinosaurs like Velociraptor. They're all jumbled together in a big mass. Now that takes quite a catastrophe to do that, just no little tiny flood. There's also unusual track features. Tracks of likely poor swimmers are rare. For instance, you wouldn't think a triceratops with those big bony head and those spikes could swim very well. You hardly find any tracks of these types of dinosaurs. Also Stegosaurus tracks, which just the shape of the body and where the bone plates are, likely couldn't swim. And so you don't find hardly any tracks of these. You find tracks of what looks like good swimmers. like T-Rex type animals, duck-billed dinosaurs. And again, with the bones, practically all the tracks are from adults and younger juveniles. Where are the tracks of young? Now, when you examine tracks in Africa with elephants, you find just as many young tracks as old tracks. So if they got preserved, first of all, you got to preserve all these features. That's a major thing that I believe the flood can do. But you have to preserve it. If you do that, you'd have a lot of tracks of young dinosaurs. But they're not there. They're rare. And here's a key one. The tracks are practically all straight. Now, I'm an elk hunter in Montana, and when I'm trailing an elk in the snow, they go all over the place. But if I spook them by accident, they run in straight lines. And
so it's like straightest distance away from you is straight out.
Right.
So they're not hiding, they're running.
They're running.
Yes.
So it's not a normal feature to see. They should be moving around, looking for food. But when they're all straight, it almost seems like they're running from something.
Yes.
So this is an unusual feature of tracks.
Huh.
Also, when you find track layers, a series of tracks, a trackway is 2 or more tracks. They're always in a single flat bedding plane. You know, the sedimentary rocks, they don't jump from one bedding plane to another. So you wonder why. Weren't there any other hills? Didn't they ever go up hills? And no, they didn't. They're always in a single flat bedding plane, which is rather unusual. And then you have some areas where you have tracks on a layer here, and then maybe 100 feet higher, you find more dinosaur tracks.
Huh.
And they are of the same species usually. And usually when 100 feet of sediments, or maybe 500, whatever it is, they consider that this is a deposition over millions of years, because they have a sedimentation rate that averages only about 1 inch every couple thousand years. So you wouldn't expect the same type of dinosaur to be up here as down in the lower levels, separated by millions of years. But when they are, that implies rapid sedimentation environment. So those are some of the unusual features for dinosaur tracks. And here's an example of straight ones right here. I couldn't get the wide angle on that, but this is in the Bighorn Basin at a display. You can see how straight they are.
Yes. Well.
And the third thing are unusual egg features. First of all, there's very few nest structures. They're not dug in a hole, except very few. There's no vegetation piled on them. That's the third one. There's little or no vegetation. If you can preserve the eggs, you should preserve the vegetation. You should get the pollen. And the eggs are laid essentially on flat bedding planes. And the problem with all this, they're laying out there in the air, and they're very porous. They would dry out in a matter of hours and days. Embryo would dry. So these are unusual egg features. And here's an example of one of the few real nest structures. See the rim right in here?
Yes.
And this is some eggs where they jacketed them right in here. It's one of about half a dozen real nest structures in the world.
Now, you've made me incredibly curious through our first part of our show. You haven't answered any questions.
No, not yet.
You've just laid out the problem, I think, magnificently, and you've made us all curious. We got to take a break, but don't you go away, because we need some answers, and don't you go away, because you'll want to hear those answers. We'll be right back.
Today's guest on Origins, Michael Oard, earned his Master of Science degree in Atmospheric Science and has retired from the National Weather Service after 30 years of service. He is currently a researcher and speaker for Creation Ministries International, where he has authored many creation articles and books, including Evidence for Creation and the Biblical Flood and Frozen in Time. Book orders are being taken at 800-616-1264. Mike can be reached at Creation Ministries International, P.O. Box 350, Powder Springs, Georgia, 30127. or visit the website at creation.com.
We are back with Michael Oard. We're talking about dinosaurs and some challenges that have come as we've found evidence of dinosaurs during the flood. How can that be? And Michael has been laying out for us some details about the unusual characteristics of the dinosaur finds during that time. Would you kind of summarize that for us before we move ahead?
Well, the challenging data is the evidence of live dinosaurs early in the flood. I showed that they had to be early in the flood. And this evidence of live dinosaurs are dinosaur tracks by the billions, dinosaur eggs by the millions, and bone beds that have been scavenged by carnivorous dinosaurs, which means a lot of activity early in the flood, which is supposed to be so chaotic, supposedly.
Sure.
That's the challenge.
Yeah.
How do we explain it?
And how do you explain it?
Well, I explained it by the beds hypothesis.
All right.
BED stands for briefly exposed diluvial sediments. In other words, they're briefly exposed, and it's a flat bedding plane. They do all their activity on that, and then it covers them up. I will explain this in a little more detail. And how do you form these beds? Well, it's because, you know, the flood wasn't just a gradual increase and then a decrease like that. I mean, a lot happened during the flood. For instance, sea level would be oscillating. As it's going up, it'd be oscillating up and down. Well, why is that? It's because there's mechanisms that cause it to do that. And so you can have a local drop in what I call sea level or flood water level and suddenly expose freshly laid sediments.
It doesn't just come up, it goes up and down.
Yeah, it goes up and down while it's going up in the long term.
Yeah.
And a local drop, you'll expose the sediments, and a local rise covers them up. You have to preserve them. That's the major feature. I mean, you have to preserve all this evidence, and that's how you do it. They have lots of trouble. See, tracks are very ephemeral. I mean, they're only going to, once you make them, they're only going to last maybe a few days to a week at the most. So you got to have a mechanism to rapidly cover them. So we have this all in the flood, and I will flesh this out a little more. Here's how it would work. These dinosaur tracks, eggs, and scavenged bone beds are on tops of thick flood sediments. So here's a block diagram or a schematic. Now you got to think of this going maybe 100 miles. You're just seeing just a slice of it. So you got to think of a large scale. So you have rapid sedimentation, and the top of the sediments are right down in here at time t1. And then at time t2, you had more sediments formed, and it's right up in here. And then in time t3, it comes right up here, and it's pretty shallow water now.
Okay, so as the sediment rises, the water gets more shallow at that spot.
Yes, and that's why we have a lot of these features on thick sediments. Then what can happen is that in one of these local falls, it's falling right down to here, and you expose the top of this. Briefly exposed diluvial. Diluvial is another name for flood. Sediments, that's the BEDS acronym. Hopefully easy to remember. A new bed is formed. Now, there's a number of ways to cause the sea level to oscillate. I mean, there's tectonic uplifts and mechanisms. So the area they're on could have uplifted. See, we had a lot of this going on all through the flood. Yeah, a lot of shaking going on.
That's right.
And tsunamis. Now, tsunamis will wipe out the edge of beds, but then they'll just gradually slow down going over, so they can just cover up a lot of it from the edge.
Sure.
And tides, of course. We had tides causing it to go up and down. And crustal shifts far away, like around the world, you have land going up, and it's going to send a wave like this around, and so you're going to have the sea level go down and then up. So we have a lot of, and this other one here I'm not going to get into, it's the dynamics of the currents. So we have at least 5 mechanisms down. There's probably hundreds of these oscillations while it's going up. And even when it's going down, it's oscillating at short period time scale. Here's a little cartoon about it. You know, you have a local drop in sea level right here, and it exposes beds. Now you got to think of this being 100 miles or so. This is just a little cut to show that, you know, they make tracks and lay eggs and dinosaurs die, and then you have a rise, and sometimes that dries them off. Sometimes they try to hang on, but regardless, it sends more sediment up that covers up the eggs and the tracks, so we can see them later on as things are eroded down to this level later on in the retreating stage of the flood. And then it can go down again, and they can do it again. You can have several levels of this happening because
they're going to climb up on top of that sediment to kind of get air.
Yeah, and
then
it happens over and over again.
Right.
And so this is how you can explain multiple levels. See, in a large area, you find multiple levels of tracks, eggs, and scavenged bone beds. So you can form this by this oscillating sea level. A good place for these beds would be in this area right in here, because we have lots of dinosaur features along the high plains and along the eastern Rocky Mountains, clear up into northern Alaska. So this would be an area, it wouldn't be all exposed at the same time. It can be areas exposed at different times, or it could be a series of shoals, but lots of tracks, especially around Moab, Utah. There's lots of tracks there. Paluxy River area down there in Texas. And there's lots of eggs in there and lots of dead dinosaurs. So this would be a great spot. But it's a worldwide phenomenon, because you find these sorts of features all over the world, indicating, again, a worldwide flood. And where do we place this dinosaur activity? Well, I think you can time it. First of all, it was after day 40, because there was so much rain, it would wash all tracks away. So you couldn't see a track before that. And they have to be dead by day 150. Everything that breathed there and lived on land was dead. But still, you piled up a lot of sediments by day 150 that eroded while the waters were running off. So I would place probably day 120 is probably when all this ended, I should say. So between day 40 and day 120 is when these tracks, eggs, and scavenged bone beds were all made in the flood. So to summarize this, dinosaur tracks, eggs, and scavenged bone beds occur early in the flood. That's where we can place them, not before or not after, because they had to all be dead by day 150. They can be explained by the beds hypothesis, briefly exposed diluvial sediments. And these are explained by sea level falls, expose the beds, and rises cover up to preserve them to this day. Beds explains these features, and we believe they formed between day 40 and day 120. We can pinpoint it in the flood. All these dinosaur features are worldwide. Again, not a local flood, a global flood. This is evidence for a global flood, supporting not only the Genesis flood, but the whole Bible as God's Word.
Dinosaurs fascinate people. So this is really important for two reasons. I mean, it's a genuine problem, but we better know what we're talking about when we talk about dinosaurs. Here's my question. It doesn't exactly relate to this, because I think you've magnificently answered the question. I'm happy with your answer. Were there dinosaurs on the ark?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Because to go on the ark, you had to breathe air and live on land. Did dinosaurs breathe air and live on land?
Yes.
I'd say so. They were created on day 6. They lived before the flood. So I'd have to say you'd have to have 2 of each kind of dinosaurs. We only have 50 kinds of dinosaurs. A lot of them are small, so we only needed 100 dinosaurs in the ark.
But if you had young ones, they wouldn't have to be that big.
No. So it's not a problem getting 100 dinosaurs on the ark.
It's not unthinkable.
And there is some powerful evidence that dinosaurs lived after the flood.
Okay.
In fact, they just found in Cambodia an 800-year temple that was covered by the jungles. They unearthed it, and they had all these bas reliefs of animals, and one of them was a bas relief of what looks like a stegosaurus.
Yes.
800 years ago, before science even knew anything about it. How would they even know how to draw that unless they actually saw one, meaning that dinosaurs lived after the flood?
So dinosaurs lived before the flood. Mm-hmm. They lived during the flood up to day about 120.
Yes.
And then some were on the ark and lived after the flood.
That's exactly right.
Okay. And you've solved the problem for us about how they lived during the flood because of the stages of the flood and because of beds, which is
yes.
our answer that does that. Magnificent. Michael, it's been a tremendous blessing having you. I think you've answered some questions for us with profound answers, and so it's been a joy. My friends, it's been great having you with us too. And until we meet again here on Origins, remember this, it's God's view that He created you. That should be your worldview too. I hope we meet again soon on Origins, and until then, God bless you, my friend.
Thank you for watching this edition of Origins. If you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint information presented today, you can download a PDF file from our website at www.originstv.org. Or for DVD of this series, send a $12 donation to cover shipping and handling and write to Origins Program, number 1306, Cornerstone Television, Wall, Pennsylvania 15148.
Origins is made possible by the faithful prayers and financial support of you, our Cornerstone family.